Well, today marks the final stage of Joseph's life, and the title of my message is God Enriches Restoration. As we begin this series, I remember the first week I mentioned that Joseph's life kind of resembles a roller coaster ride with highs and the lows. He experienced some moments of great success, but these were often followed with adversity. Joseph reached the pinnacle of his life, but found himself in the depth also, from the pit to prison and eventually the palace. Well, as we conclude Joseph's story today, for those of you who have missed out and who are so unfamiliar with these details, I'll recount a brief overview. Well, following this betrayal by his brother, which we talked about on the first week, and he was being sold as a slave, Joseph was purchased by Potiphar. And he was like a general, he's like a commander in Egypt. And as mentioned in week 2, Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce Joseph, which he resisted. And as a consequence of that, Joseph was unjustly imprisoned. And while in jail, Joseph encountered 2 men, and he had a chance to interpret their dreams. And just before today's message, Pharaoh had a dream that confounded all the wise men and all the magicians in Egypt. The dream involved the Nile River, symbolizing the heart of Egypt, where 7 fat and healthy cows grazed, and they were eating, and it was just finding peace there, followed by 7 skinny cows that devoured the fat ones. What kind of dream is this, right? So Pharaoh woke up, and it was like a nightmare, but this sequence repeated with the picture of grains in the farm in another dream. In Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh was so disturbed by the dream that he became ill physically. And at that moment, the cupbearer recalls his time in prison and remembers Joseph and finally brings Joseph out of prison to stand in front of Pharaoh. And just imagine yourself, just picture yourself as Joseph, standing in front of the most powerful man at that time of the history, aware of his deep disturbance caused by the dream. It must have felt life or death matter for him right now, because every word he spoke could determine success or failure. However, one thing that we know is Joseph was grounded in the knowledge of the source of his interpretation, as expressed in Genesis chapter 41, verse 16. He says, "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied. "But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." You see, Joseph, confident in the origin of his interpretation, fearlessly explains the dream to Pharaoh. 7 years of plenty symbolized by fat cows, followed by 7 years of famine represented by the skinny cows. And he advises Pharaoh to save up during the years of the plenty, storing 1/5 of all crops under the supervision of an appointed official. You think tithing is a lie. Right now, it's like 1/5 right now. These stored crops would sustain them through the years of famine. And Pharaoh was amazed. But do you know what really impresses me in this very moment? Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the wealthy and the most powerful man, someone who had no worries in his life, someone who could have everything that he wanted, says something so amazing from verse 37 through 40. In verse 37, we don't have to look in the verse, but it says Pharaoh and his officials were pleased with Joseph's idea. And then in verse 38, Pharaoh asks his officials, "Can we find anyone like this man? Can we find anyone like this young man, so obviously and clearly filled with the Spirit of God?" The word that was used to describe God here is Elohim. The same word that was used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, when God created the heavens and the earth. Elohim means mighty and supreme. And just pause one moment and just take it in. Think about it. A man at the very top with all the power and strength, a man who was praised as the God of Egypt, is saying that there is God, not him, but there is God, one true, mighty, supreme God. This is a big deal, isn't it? When you see a person whom God uses, it doesn't just make their life better, but it also makes the lives of people around them better. And let us see what happens in Joseph in verses 39 through 40. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court or my houses, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. So basically he's saying, you're going to be the second man in charge. The person God uses lead others to God, not only with their words, but with their lifestyle. Now, just like how Joseph has explained to Pharaoh about his dream, Egypt has 7 amazing years of plenty, so much crops, so much wealth, so much prosperity. And then here comes 7 years of not enough food. And during these years, Jacob, Joseph's dad, sends his sons to Egypt to get grains. Hey, there's a famine right now. We don't have anything to eat. I heard in Egypt they're selling food, so why don't you all go? And these are Joseph's older brothers, recounting the ones who threw Joseph into a pit, tried to kill him but decided not to, but sold him as a slave. And guess what? Dun, dun, dun. They're standing in front of Joseph. But it's almost been over 20 years since the brothers last saw Joseph, so they didn't recognize him. But Joseph recognizes them. They never imagined Joseph would be the second in command in Egypt. But Joseph sitting on that seat way higher than their brothers, and brothers just bowing down to them. Joseph recognized every single thing. Just picture yourself as Joseph. How do you think you'll feel at that very moment? What would you do right away? Lots of us must feel really angry and frustrated if it's just perfect time to show them, who's in charge, who's the boss, right? And I'll be in a different tone. I'll reveal myself to my brothers if I was Joseph. Yo, see who's in charge now. Right? Do you remember the time you threw me under the pit? Do you remember the time? Do you remember the dreams? Now who's bowing to who? I would be that. Lucky I'm the oldest brother, and I don't have older brothers, but Joseph had a bit of that feeling. He tests his brothers by putting them through tough situation. But when he hears the story and the news of his dad, Jacob, whom he loved so much, and also his little brother, Benjamin, he just couldn't control himself. And that's where our story really begins. What a long introduction. But when we talk about Joseph, I don't know how many times you've been to church and heard the story of Joseph, but whenever we talk about Joseph, we usually talk about faithfulness. Joseph was faithful. Joseph was always doing the right thing. He was a dreamer, right? That's another thing that we talk about. Sometimes we talk about God was with Joseph all the time and he made everything prosperous. We tend to think those kind of stuff. Or sometimes we tend to think Joseph endured all the tough times. And all of that is true and really important. But today we're going to talk about something very special, restoration. How Joseph was restored himself and how he restored his pain and his broken relationship. And to understand how things got better for Joseph, the restoration in Joseph's life, we'll start by looking at something called interpretation. Interpretation. What is interpretation, you might ask? According to Oxford Dictionary, it says it's the action of explaining the meaning of something. What does restoration have to do with interpretation? Because interpretation offers a strategy to restoration. Why do we have to talk about interpretation right now when we talk about Joseph? Because Joseph's life was filled with interpretation. Joseph had 2 dreams when he was young, and he didn't understand what it meant. The lack of interpretation made his brothers hate him so much. Later, Joseph had to interpret the situation with Potiphar's wife. He said, my master has given me everything but you, because you are his. And how can I sin against God? Joseph was innocent. He didn't do anything wrong, but he ended up in jail. Joseph must have had this time of reminding himself, why am I here? What did I do wrong? And he had to interpret the situation he was in. While he was in prison, he also had to interpret 2 dreams of his prison mates. One was a cupbearer and the other was baker. When cupbearer was free and he went out of the jail, he forgot about the promise that he had with Joseph. He forgot about Joseph. And Joseph must have once again had to interpret the event. Once out of prison, he now had to explain the dream to Pharaoh. And through this interpretation, he became the second in command in Egypt, the most powerful country at that time. And now, here is Joseph interpreting the situation as he meets his brothers who betrayed him and sold him into slavery. In verse 1, he says Joseph couldn't control his emotion. He couldn't control his emotion. He started crying. The tears would start to come out. And those, it's just like, you're so saddened that you're just crying out loud, and the entire land of Egypt could hear Joseph. And he would tell everyone standing with him to leave that space except his brothers. So now no one was there when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. Joseph is all by himself, facing the things that hurt him. Joseph's dealing with all the unfairness and betrayals, and he's standing in front of his pain. And now he has to decide how to interpret his encounter with his brothers. And I want to encourage you today that this will be the message for you. Maybe I'm talking to you right now because you might be standing in front of something that hurt you. Maybe you are facing someone who left a scar inside of you. I pray that today's message will give you a sense of new interpretation. And today we'll be studying 3 strategies that would help you with restoration in any kind of things that you have. All the brokenness, all the pains, all the sufferings that you are enduring right now. How can you restore it? I'll tell you 3 strategies. First, we need a different interpretation. We need a different interpretation. Here, I want to share with you what might be one of the greatest turning point in how I see Joseph. First, Joseph knew exactly what his brothers did to him. Could we look at verse 5 of today's passage? And I put an emphasis on that. It says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here. You sold me. He's not denying that there are the ones responsible for this whole situation. He's placing blames on his brothers who's standing right in front of him. He's not denying the dysfunction of everything. You sold me. You let me down. You're the reason. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be in Egypt if you guys hadn't sold me. I would be at home with my parents and with my mom and with my dad. I didn't have to go through all this unfair and false accusation. But pay attention to what Joseph says next. He says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. And I pray that you will have ears to hear. I've been praying all week for God to enlighten you and give you an open heart to receive this message. Listen carefully. You sold me, for God sent me. You sold me, but for God sent me. These are not two separate events. You might be asking, did the brother sell you, or did God send you? But this is not two sides of story. It's one. Look at how it's constructed. Can we see that line again? Joseph doesn't say, you sold me, but God sent me. He doesn't say that. But rather, it's not talking about two separate events, but talking about one event. The second one is a continuation of the first. You sold me, for God sent me. There's a difference. So Joseph is telling his brothers right now, yes, you guys threw me under the pit. You guys broke my heart. Yes, you guys left me laughing at me. Yes, you guys completely forgot about me. Yes, you guys lied to my dad about where I was. But you know what? Now I've got an interpretation of this whole event. And I love how Stephen Furtick, the pastor at Elevation Church, says, he says, it's not an event that determines the outcome, but your interpretation of the event that determines the outcome. Isn't this so good? It's not an event that determines the outcome, but your interpretation of the event that determines the outcome. It's not about what happened. It's about how you take that in to yourself. The first one was an event. You sold me. It happened. It's a fact. You sold me. Right? Everyone knows. The brothers knew. They sold him. But the second one is an interpretation. For God sent me. It is how I see the event. It's a perspective. It is understanding the situation. And here is a question that I want to ask you today. Which one are you going to live in? An event or an interpretation? And let me tell you this, it's not an event, but an interpretation that changes our life. Second point is this, we need a different interpreter. We need a different interpreter. In order for us to think like Joseph, we have to come to a conclusion that it can only be done when we have a good and right interpreter. I learned this recently, but an interpreter is different from translator. I thought it was just always the same, right? Could you translate this speaker, right? But actually, translator is the one who translates written text. But interpreter is the one who interprets spoken language. Did you know this? I don't know. I just found out, and it has nothing to do with the passage, but I just wanted to share. And here it comes that we all need to ask ourselves today, who is your interpreter? When I, myself, is an interpreter of my own life, I'll focus on the event and be done with it. Let me tell you why. Because when we are the interpreter of our own lives, we interpret our present through our past. We interpret our purpose through our pain. We interpret our entire life through the small events and small situations. We keep focusing on who have hurt us. We keep listening to what others said about us. And you keep bringing out the pains that you were hiding and hiding for the longest time. And it is messing with you. That is what the enemy does. It will take a God-given desire and God-given emotion and distort it. And this happens inside the church too. All of a sudden, everything that I do for a church is slowly shifting to my own glory. I'm doing it for myself. And you know what I'm talking about. All of a sudden, I have to be recognized. I need people to see how faithful I am. I need to show how spiritual I am. I need all the attention I can get to boast about what I've done for the church. And you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it. We've all seen it. This is when the church gets into drama and into splits and into fights. But when the Spirit of God is my interpreter, you have a new lens to see things differently with a different perspective. God, how can I be a blessing to people? God, how can I humbly serve others? God, how can I give more of myself to you and to your church? Ask God to interpret your desire. Lastly, as we have a different interpretation through a different interpreter, the result is this: the right interpretation leads to restoration. Going back to Genesis chapter 45, verse 5, Joseph reminds himself of how he was rejected by his brothers. Recently, my first two kids, Titus and Zoe, took a personal survey test, to see which school they belong to in Hogwarts. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, we cannot be friends. I'm a massive Harry Potter fan, but church, please don't judge me. I read it when I was in middle school, and I was so into it. And then Titus started reading Harry Potter, and then I told him I go to Hufflepuff. Don't take it too seriously, okay? And they wanted to try it, so they answer some of the questions, and they ask you like a personal questions. You know, people talk about like MBTI, like a survey question, personality test, something like that. And through this survey, there was one question that they both answered the same. And the question was this: what are you most afraid of? And there were many options like darkness, being trapped in a small room, or ghosts. But they both answered isolation, being alone, feeling rejected. You see, a sense of rejection is a big issue in this world. And at the age of 17, for our boy Joseph, going through this teenage year, going through puberty, lucky he didn't have TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram, this must have been a huge trauma to him, being rejected by his own brothers. But just look at how Joseph has transitioned his pain into purpose. Yes, you have rejected me. Yes, you have betrayed me. But you know what? I've experienced the goodness of God. I've experienced the grace of God. So I have let go of my resentment. I refuse to hold on to it. You see, what one calls rejection, God calls it provision. That was good. What one calls rejection, God calls it provision. You sold me, for God sent me. Yes, maybe your husband, your wife, your parents, your kids, your friends, maybe your people that you've loved and trusted so much, maybe they pushed you into a pit. Maybe they hurt you. They gave you pain. But you know what? God was preparing all that for an advantage in my life. So I want to challenge you and encourage you today. Interpret your pain through the lens of God's purpose. Interpret your feeling through your faith. That was the secret of Joseph. Even though he was thrown into a pit, when he was in Potiphar's house, even when he was thrown into the jail, when he was innocent, the Lord was with Joseph. So for him, I don't need my feelings to define my future. I don't need my situation to define my identity, but I would need the faith in Christ to see God's purpose and God's plan for my life. As I wrap up, I want to invite the praise team to the stage. You see, church, I didn't preach for 2 weeks, so it's the third week that I'm coming back. And I prayed all those weeks that this message is for someone who needs God-given interpretation. All the time, I thought I needed an explanation. All this time, I wanted some facts. I was thirsty for answers. But you know what, God? I need you. I need the faith to interpret my life differently. I know some of you have been struggling with kids. I know some of you have been struggling to have kids. Maybe some of you are suffering with marriage. Some of us are desperately looking for jobs. Some of us are in financial difficulties. Some of us are dealing with emotional and relational damages. And I don't understand why all these things are happening, but let us remember the God of all creation, the Elohim, the God that is mighty, the supreme being, but who is so intimate, who is so personal to us. The one that we can call as friend and then as our Father is with us, even though I might not feel it at this very moment. Trusting God. Even when I feel like I'm abandoned, He's with you. Even when you feel like you are in a fire, He's the fourth man in the fire. Even when you feel like you're on a small boat in a rushing wind, there's waves just rushing towards you. He's with you on that boat. And we know He's the one, the Elohim. He's a mighty God. He's a supreme God who can calm the storm. So trust in Him. Trust in Him. Bring out all your brokenness to Him. Bring out all the hurt that you had. That mighty God is near you right now. Even though you don't say it out loud, even though you don't speak it out, if you know it, God hears it. Bring it out to God. God, I don't have a power to live another day. God, I don't have a strength to go on. I don't know what to do with my child. I don't know what to do with my parents. I don't know what to do with my spouse. I don't know how to solve this problem of the deep sin inside of me. I don't know how to deal with all this brokenness in my life. But God, give me. When I just focus on the reality and the situation, I fall and discouraged, depressed, anxious. But through the lens of faith, I want to see your purpose and your plan. I want to interpret this situation differently. I want to interpret this broken relationship differently. I want to interpret these events differently because I know you are for me. Who will be against me? So Father, thank you for your word and thank you for your people. God, just like how you have said through Joseph, we ask you would interpret this message to everyone according to each one of their needs. God, you know our needs. God, I pray that we would have a different interpretation of seeing where we are and how we are. Thank you. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's all stand as we respond.